in an automobile, you pre-design in the seatbelts, the backup cameras. You don't go and build the vehicle and come back in and retrofit because of cost, because of time, because of construction related incidents. So again, you do the work up front, you end up with a better product that is functionable. So
Right.
as organizations are going through brownfield replacement, greenfield build, how do you start taking steps to proactively begin implementing these procedures into your environment and not being reactive? It's more of a shift in mindset, I would call it.
Welcome to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. In each episode, we dive into the world of industrial cybersecurity. Join us as we cover the latest trends, innovations, and practical insights as we talk with leaders and practitioners across the industry. Gear up and let's get into this week's episode.
Hi, I'm Craig Duckworth.
And I'm Dino Busalaki.
What's on your mind today, Dino?
Manufacturing resiliency. How do you build and design cyber resiliency into your manufacturing plant floor environment, right?
Great topic. That's something that is very relevant, is very pertinent. And I think that as organizations are looking to walk down this path or journey of cyber resilience, they should begin practicing and figuring out how to begin implementing this upfront versus retrofitting on the backside.
I think it kind of goes back to those SANS critical controls points, of which for the plant floor, the OT environment, we have 5, right? And trying to understand what those critical control points are, right? For cybersecurity in OT, whether it be your incident response plan, your defensible architecture, your network monitoring, how are you monitoring that ICS environment, your remote access into that environment, and your risk and vulnerability management, right? And so if you follow those 5 OT critical control points, that are outlined in the SANS playbook, the framework, IT has 15 of those maybe. OT we have 5. Is how do you implement that into your OT cybersecurity strategy? Again, overall manufacturing resiliency, but then how do you implement, in a proactive manner, cybersecurity into your plant floor?
Well, and I've heard you say this probably more times than I can think, that it's like safety in an automobile. You pre-design in the seatbelts, the backup cameras. You don't go and build the vehicle and come back in and retrofit because of cost, because of time, because of construction related incidents. So again, you do the work up front, you end up with a better product that is functionable. So
Right.
As organizations are going through brownfield replacement, greenfield build, how do you start taking steps to proactively begin implementing these procedures into your environment and not being reactive? It's more of a shift in mindset, I would call it.
Yeah, and I think that organizations need to think about a more comprehensive interviewing process with their OEMs and their system integrators, right? Because, silos is the word I'm going to use, because when you think of the plant floor, a lot of those machine centers, those skids, those OEMs and control systems integration people bring to the table vary pretty widely, right? It's rare for us to go into a manufacturing facility and say that it's 100% Rockwell or it's 100% Siemens, right? There's usually a blend of different technologies that are being used within that manufacturing facility, right? From equipment that comes in potentially from all over the world and designed and built by different organizations all over the world. So how are you going to get those seatbelts and those backup cameras and those sensors and those airbags, and from a safety perspective, consistent throughout your design within your plant floor? And so you have to have this 30,000-foot view of what is our OT cybersecurity strategy going to look like, right? If you get back to those 5 critical controls that I was talking about, that SANS outlines in that security framework.
Yeah, all valid points that during this OT, IT convergence, during this journey that organizations take, those are all considerations that need to be thought through on this approach.
Right.
It's not a silver bullet.
Right.
There's not a one size fits all. There's not a one technology fixes everything. It's that back to the core basic foundations of defense in depth, architecture. How do you best apply? Organizations have to look at this as the same way they do safety.
Right.
It's got to get better.
Which is non-negotiable, right? Safety is non-negotiable.
No, it's not.
And OT can't take the position that cybersecurity is somebody else's problem, i.e., IT, right? You can't say, well, IT's got that responsibility. And many times in the work that we engage with, we'll find OT cybersecurity technologies that have been bought by IT, and OT is completely unaware of what they want. And at the same time, IT is not driving a strategy, again, back through that OT ecosystem to make sure that there's some standards in place in order to ensure that you have, for instance, ICS continuous monitoring capability within your plant. And if so, at what depth? And when we say at what depth, how much visibility do you want to have? And if you're familiar with the Purdue model, and if you don't know what it is, please look it up. Think of the University of Purdue, right? Not the chicken guys, and look at the Purdue model and determine how far down in those levels do you want to go to gain visibility into those assets. And do not make the assumption that that stuff is air gapped and it's not connected to your network. It is. All right. You will find that it is connected. It's the nature of the beast, right? If you don't understand how the industrial control system architecture is set up for the infrastructure, that those PLCs are on, those HMIs, those drives, those motors, those pumps, those robots, all of that OT and IoT equipment, everything, and remote access. How do people get in there and fix problems, right? Do they come on site with laptops? Yes, they do. Do they come in remotely from somewhere in the world? Yes, they do, right? Do we find cradle point cellular modems out there? Yes, we find those. VPN, concentrators out there in those panels? Yes, we do. So understand that, right? And if you're a medium-sized manufacturer, you should find several hundred to several thousand assets within your manufacturing environment. Not a handful, but literally probably thousands.
We see organizations, Dino, and this is very common, that an IT will come in, they'll drop a technology in, and they're seeing what's often referred to as that north-south traffic, just the traffic that's going into the enterprise through a firewall that they're being, let's call it, allowed to see, because that's the way that the OT teams architected that infrastructure when they built it. There are many layers deep in a lot of cases below that PLC based on additional NIC cards and other networks that are performing that controls layer, or often referred to as the east-west traffic. And when you look at how do I gather all the data, you made a perfect point. What does 100% visibility look like? One, is that important to the organization? Do you need to see 100%? Do you know what effort, time, material that's going to take to get 100%? Do you know what that's going to cost you? And it's different for every facility, but to stand back on a pedestal and say, we want 100%, give me 100%, that's a bold statement. And a lot of organizations don't understand what that means.
Well, that's the disconnect between IT and OT, right? When you talk about east-west traffic, we're talking about control traffic, right? And that's very critical, right? The criticality of that east-west traffic or that control traffic, it means two things. One is safety. The other is process integrity, right? Because so OT and their ecosystem that design and build these systems go to great lengths to secure those comms within that control system environment. The question is the integrity of those comms, right? And if you're not watching them, right, it's the old adage, you can't manage what you're not measuring, And we've been able, the OT environment is all, and I think IT is allowed this to happen, fall back and say it's air gapped. It's not connected, right? Well, you have to demonstrate that that's really true. And even if it is, how do you make sure it stays that way, right? Because over time, things get connected. And when we're talking about Ethernet and how easy it is to start connecting devices up, within that environment, it happens pretty quickly. It happens all the time. These environments are very dynamic. They're not as static as you think. And so then that visibility that you thought that you had a good grasp of, all of a sudden you're missing 30, 40, 50% or more of the connected devices inside that manufacturing facility that have software, right? They have firmware, they have applications, they have operating systems, there's networks down there, and nobody is paying attention to what's going on in that space because the control side does not fall into IT's realm of responsibility for, again, those two reasons, safety and process integrity. So the only way to really fix this is this OT ecosystem has to be engaged and involved in that, what that cybersecurity strategy is that you're driving, what's your roadmap, right? And if you've chosen a tool and you picked a top OT intrusion detection system of some sort, and there's many out there, some are good, some are okay. Point is, if you've chosen one already, and you've got new machines coming in, new packaging line, back to Craig's point, brownfield, greenfield, expansion, lifecycle replacement activities in that plant, you should be thinking of sitting down with that OEM, that system integrator that's designing that machine or working on designing your control systems and saying, I need to have visibility down inside that control system space, right? Design that seatbelt in, design those backup cameras in, those airbags, right, into that machine center before it gets to your plant.
It's easier. You build it into the project, you build it into the budget, you allow for the space, the real estate, the power, the connectivity inside those panels, inside that machine center that we're talking about up front. It adds minimal to the cost of the project, but the value that the organization gets on the backside is 20, 40, 50 fold what the upfront cost is to do that. And you make it a standard. You say, okay, going forward, this is our standard. This is what we're doing within our OT control space in our industrial control area as we begin modifying. IT goes through technology refresh every 3 to 5 years. It's a fact. On the OT side, it's a lot longer cycle. So those assets are out there for 15, 20, 30 years at times. So if you're going to replace something, if you're going to go through that effort to update that, do it right. Do it correct the first time and build it in so that it's there.
It needs to be non-negotiable, like safety.
Yeah, for sure.
If you have an OEM that's pushing back, that doesn't want to put a sensor inside that machine center to passively collect information, not actively in that environment, but passively in that environment, to get that metadata down there that's relevant to determine those 5 OT SAN critical controls, defensible architecture, continuous monitoring, vulnerability management, risk assessment, right? Remote access in there, in your incident response plan. Those guys need to be part of that conversation. If you've got machine builders that are pushing back, then you have to question, are we using the right machine builder? Is what you should be thinking, right? Because OT shouldn't just be able to run roughshod and say, we really want this machine, right? I want that, that Ford F-150. I don't want the Tesla truck, right? I don't want that. I want the Ford F-150. Well, if it means that you got to move towards the Tesla, which is probably a bad analogy these days, but my point is the technology in that compared to the F-150 is significantly different, right?
Yeah, but I would say there are exceptions to every rule.
And it doesn't have to be the cost. Cost is not the override. It's much cheaper to do this up front than to come back to the retro and try to put that stuff in after the fact.
Cost should be number 3 or 4 on the decision matrix of what I'm procuring. What am I buying or lower?
But it's a rounding error. You're talking about let's say a $2 million packaging
process
of some sort, right? And you're talking about several grand in technology,
you're right.
on something that's a couple $1,000,000. It's a rounding error,
Right.
and it's not disruptive to put it in up front versus trying to do it in the retro because it's a little disruptive because of the downtime and some of the engineering that needs to be done in order to get that technology retrofitted in.
Well, there's always an exception to every rule. If you have one OEM that is the only manufacturer of something that is unique, purpose built for your industry, and no one else in the world makes this widget, and you have to use them, then there may be some negotiations, some communications back and forth with that vendor. But if there are 5 or 6 different provider OEMs of the equipment you use, and the one that you're favored is taking a hardline no of we're not going to, then look at the other 4, see what you can find out as long as the feature functionality is the same. But you got to figure this out.
Well, I think that's where the crux of the problem is because you got to think about who the buyer is, who's the influencer on that machine, right? And it's the OT guys. And
Correct.
IT influence on that is pretty weak, meaning that it's almost non-existent, right? Because the OT team doesn't have the knowledge and experience and understanding of why this is important. IT does. OT does not. The problem is the people that are driving the decision on the machines that you're procuring and having built and designed for your business, there's no IT involvement. Right? It's primarily 99.99%, if not 100%, driven by the OT organization, not IT's influence. There's no influence from IT in that discussion, right? And at the same time, OT would have to be able to make the effort to understand that machine's operation, its process, how it's put together in order to determine and assess why they want to get cybersecurity features and functionalities and solutions built into that machine center. Because OT they're not in a position from a knowledge standpoint or the position of even it being their responsibility. But safety is their responsibility, right? Is safety IT's responsibility? Maybe if they're at the plant and they're in their work, and they better be thinking of how operating safely. But typically, traditionally, safety is not their job.
Well, OT will tell you that security gets in the way of making product. And if you're looking at safety's first, and you take the safety approach, then it's an easier conversation.
Yeah. And it's always the other old adage. It's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission, right? And you're only going to get so many of those on a safety violation.
Yeah, and that's like one or less.
One or right. It might depends on the event and how bad it is, what that incident is, right? True statement. And this needs to take that same approach, right? That's how you change and drive this narrative in a different direction. If you tag it with a cybersecurity thought process, I mean a safety thought process.
Right. Yeah. No, you're right. Well, hopefully organizations are trying to figure that out. Look at what's the regulation within their industry, what's the requirement for their business need. Take that requirement back and say, okay, how can we architect this in? How can we build this in? How can we ensure that it meets our security protocol, our governance policy, our risk matrix, and look at it from a holistic standpoint? Again, you can't do it in a vacuum. Right. That's part of the problem is organizations are trying to do this in a vacuum, and you can't.
Well, and it can't be the path of least resistance either, right?
You can't check a box. Nope.
Right. And so when it comes to regulations, it's the minimal amount, right? Yeah. They're not raising the bar per se. Nope. The minimum, meaning that, so for instance, a regulation would say that you have to have an asset inventory. Okay. Should it be continuous, or can you just get it once a year or every other year or every other quarter?
It's a napkin. And I got it when I built the plant 15 years ago. Right. It's changed 1,000 times, but I have an inventory. I'm good.
Yeah. And invariably, most of the plants we go into, what do they lack? Documentation. Yeah. Right. Back to your point. Right. Mm-hmm. When we're in there trying to do our due diligence and doing our research and discovery, the first thing we go after is documentation, and we get this deer in the headlight look from most clients, like, yeah, we don't have that, or they hand us something and 20 or 30% of it's wrong.
Bill that's run the plant for 35 years, it's in his head and he can tell you anything you want, and he's retiring next week and we can't get him to give it to us.
Right. That happens a lot, especially when the plants have been bought and sold, merger and acquisitions, and to your point on the life cycle being so different, things just get lost over time.
Right.
Because they don't change in 3, 4, 5, 7 years. It's measured in decades. Right. And so that documentation it disappears, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, right?
Yeah. Yep. Very accurate.
Well, I hope this was informative for you folks out there. So if you have any questions, please look us up. We have plenty of advice and information to provide on the topic. So
I think that as you listen and as you are evaluating and you're looking for guidance, you're looking for partners, you're looking for a way to take the journey. A couple things to remember. Don't do it alone. Choose a partner that understands the industry, understands your business, that understands the cyber physical system arena and how it applies to various manufacturing and industrial layers. Work with them, collaborate, and don't try to be in a vacuum. Would be my best advice I could think of.
Well, you find an organization that has a manufacturing mindset. People that spend all day, every day working within these manufacturing environments, right? Too often we find clients whose IT organization, for example, have never stepped foot on the plant floor or haven't been there in years. Or a chunk of their staff is even unfamiliar with the plant altogether. And so you have to change that dynamic, to the extent of you have to be able to speak the same language as the people on the plant floor. And you need to understand what it takes to make that facility operate and run and do what it does. And until you're at that level, from a technology perspective, from an IT perspective, you're really going to have to rely on the organization that have designed and built that equipment.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Totally agree. All right, Dino, great conversation.
Yep.
Great conversation. I appreciate it. Very insightful. Hopefully everybody took something away from this and can go back to your organization and try and move one step forward.
Yep. Appreciate you listening.
Thanks for tuning in to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. To stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to click the follow or subscribe button now. And if you found this podcast helpful or have a topic you'd like us to discuss, please leave us a review or let us know. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.